up guys, going to show you reacting to the video. In today's video is Lightning had the immunity idols. So I thought this was funny because Lindsay still gets voted off like cannon. I thought this would be pretty funny since Lightning is the most unstrategical player on the island. As much as I love Lightning, him just being the second boot, it kind of made sense, but at the same time, you kind of think it kind of sucked because he went from a winner to like being the second boot of All-Stars. Like, kind of crazy that he was the first boot, but what if somehow Lightning had the idol this whole time? Right, so I make another video on Lightning and Scott the pieces, but if who does he vote for between Scott and Joe? Because they're obviously the two he's going to vote for. I think he votes off Joe because the reason he votes for Joe is quite simple. Joe, he has a lot more reason to vote off Joe than he does for Scott in this timeline, and he doesn't like her. So even though he acted surprised, I feel like he does vote off Joe here. Now, episode 3 won't change, except Scott doesn't get himself eliminated by Joe because Joe's not here. So Lightning is just here, kind of just chilling and kind of shooting. To be honest, the first person shot is Alejandro, like in canon. Like in canon. Then it is Zoe and Mike. No, Mike gets shot then. Sierra gets shot after being distracted by Cameron. Duncan still saves Gwen from the leech. Heather gets shot. Gwen gets shot. And it's down. Cameron. Courtney uses Sam's human shield. Zoe. Courtney gets shot by Lightning. Zoe gets shot by Lightning. And then Scott shoots Zoe after he shoots her in a hidden hiding spot in the cave. So I think the villains actually win here. Since in the original, I think Joe was distracted with other things that made her lose that challenge, so I do think the villains win. And it's clearly going to be Courtney, since she cost him the challenge, and I think the villains still lose here, since Scott, I feel like he would get to the final round with him and Lightning, and Zoe, Courtney, then he shoots. Yeah, actually, no, the villains win. So they vote off Courtney, since she's the biggest threat, and she used Sam as a human shield. However, Duncan and Courtney never swap teams because she's already eliminated. Now, episode 4 is the pancake episode, and with Lightning being here, Duncan on the villains, and Courtney not being present, I don't think it changes the fact that they still win, and Sam gets voted off like normal. Now, in Mood Madness, Mal is still trying to mess with everyone on the team. Duncan and Gwen go around on the bridge because they're a couple, and Scott and Lightning go across together. Scott sabotages the heroes like normal, instead of Courtney, so he sabotages them. Alejandro and Heather and Scott are trying to convince Lightning into their alliance. However, I think Heather would actually follow Gwen and Duncan, since in this timeline, she's trying to convince them as her allies. So it'd make more sense for Heather to actually go with them, rather than Scott, Lightning, and Alejandro. Scott's trying to convince Lightning. I think Heather wants Lightning as well, but they mainly want Duncan and Gwen because they're a duo, and they're going to be threatening when they merge. And if they get Gwen, they get Duncan. So it's kind of how they would think it works. Hamsters lose. Cameron volunteers as self-sacrifice. He still gets bought into the villains. Episode 6, no opposite egg inspection. Mike and Zoe win the challenge. Duncan fails to get the eggs off the bird. Gwen thinks he's being sweet rather than making fun of him. She actually comforts Duncan. Heather is still trying to go into one vote off Alejandro, like in normal. However, I think Alejandro is more likely to convince Lightning to his side than Heather, since Alejandro on the surface is a very charming person, so I feel like him and Scott Scott still votes off Alejandro, so without the idol, Alejandro gets eliminated. Episode 7 is Sucker's Punch. To be honest, let's go for the fizz. Mike and Zoe both pass their fears. Sierra fails. Cameron fails his fear. Lightning passes. Scott fails against Fang. Heather's assumed wrestler. She passes. Now, Duncan and Gwen are a bit of an interesting case because Duncan's fear isn't Courtney. Well, Gwen's fear is Courtney, right? But I think Duncan's fear is now Courtney, since he's not the bird. It's only a bad bird. Now, Gwen's, I feel like, is probably fighting underground. And Gwen definitely passes. Duncan, he fails against Courtney. Gwen also fighting Courtney fails, meaning 2-2, and it's a tiebreaker. So Mal and Zoe get to pick which one they should get a fight, because I feel like it's a rule where Chris says the people who pass get to actually do this. And Lightning volunteers himself, and I think Mal volunteers. And unfortunately for Lightning, he loses. So the villains got elimination. And Mal and Zoe want to get rid of Lightning for last season. And Sierra, Mal and Zoe and Sierra probably go for Scott here. Since in the original timeline, you see, in the original timeline, Zoe and Mal don't like Scott, and I think Sierra would probably go for Gwen. The other two go for Scott, though, because although they don't like Lightning, Zoe and Sierra isn't a big fan of Lightning, so I do think they possibly target Lightning here, for not only being the biggest threat, but the strongest threat left on the island. But I think they go for Scott by default, because Scott is more schemish. Actually, I'm actually unsure who they go for, so these two pass. Duncan, Gwenville, Cameron fails, Scott fails. So that's two. It's a tie then. So it's a tie. So whatever the tiebreaker is, I think Lightning could easily be Mal. Right? Lightning is stronger than Mal. I think. He's never fought Mal, but it's kind of hard to say. But I feel like the villains kind of lose because they lost more people. Now, Mike and Zoe won't vote Cameron because they're friends with him. So instead, I think these two go for Scott because Scott's more schemish. On top of the fact Zoe and Mal just don't like Scott. And Lightning hasn't really done that much to Mike. And while they have been mean to Cameron, Lightning antagonistic towards a Lightning would have been more antagonistic towards Cameron. Scott is actually somebody who is a huge threat. So I do think they go for Lightning. Because he was mean to Cameron last season, so I do think Lightning gets voted off here. Which, I mean, it sucks, but there's nothing I can really do for him. He just is going here. So it's the merge, and the difference we have Sierra instead of Alejandra and Courtney. We have Sierra and Heather, okay. So now everybody gets on the boats. Gwen and Duncan go on the boat together. Heather goes on the boat by herself, which leaves Sierra, Mike, Zoe. Mal goes on the boat by himself, leaves Scott, Cameron, Zoe, and Sierra on the boat of losers. Now, Scott never falls into the water since Sierra is here to carry him. Ultimately, Mal's turns around to go save Zoe. And I think now Heather wins immunity, since she would have Alejandra's boat. But Duncan and Gwen could get in their boat much faster, since Duncan was able to make cars, so he'd definitely get working better than Courtney. However, it doesn't matter for two different reasons. One, Duncan never blows up the mansion this timeline, since him and Gwen are still together, and Duncan has to have to try and prove himself as the solo bad boy, because he's not doing that bad boy arc. And two, Mal rigged this elimination. So Cameron actually remains eliminated in this episode. Now, the next episode, Sierra is enraged about this. However, I feel like they would target Heather because it's Heather for rigging the votes. Like, Scott has more of a reason to get rid of Cameron. So I feel like Mal does frame Scott here. But Scott would have had noticed that Mal put it under his pillow. So Scott would have been 2 steps ahead of Mal. And in this timeline, he frames someone else. He decides to frame Sierra. Because Sierra is a huge threat. And in this timeline, Sierra was obsessed with Cameron. So Sierra makes no sense. He puts them back under Mal's pillow. Sierra gets angry because she thinks Mal might rig the votes against Cameron, so she could stay away from him. Mike tries to deny this, and they all go off together. Sierra goes off by herself, Mike and Zoe, Scott on his own, and Heather. Ultimately, everyone gets captured, and Dunk wins to win immunity, and it's elimination time. So now we have an actual vote, and the vote's a bit all over the place. Sierra votes for Mike. Zoe and Mike vote for Sierra, since she votes Sierra. Scott is kind of tricky, but Gwen and Duncan vote for Heather. Heather votes off, I think, votes for Sierra. So that's 2 on Sierra, 2 Mal, 2 Heather. Scott's the swing vote. So we gotta vote for Heather, Mal, Sierra. Now, Scott wouldn't really know any of these people, but I think he goes for Mike by default, since Mal is a big threat, and this timeline Zoe and Mike are a couple, so I think he'd rather take his chances with Gwen and Duncan because they've been on his team rather than Mike. So Mike is eliminated, and in this episode his mind resets, and he is back from being Mal to Mike. Now in episode 10 is the obstacle kill course. Sierra is the only person we don't know how well she does in Heather, and I don't think Heather's going to be able to match Duncan, who's going to be able to win this challenge without Mal, since he was seen in Total Drama Island doing very well in the obstacle kill course challenge. Now, Heather and Scott are in a bit of trouble here, since they're the only villains left but decide to work together. Now, between Sierra and Zoe, I think Gwen and Duncan want to get rid of Heather, but they also know Sierra has super powerful rage powers. Zoe is going to vote for Scott. Scott is going to vote get Heather to vote for Sierra because Heather knows in World Tour that Sierra is very strong and very smart. Duncan and Gwen vote for Heather, so it's 2 votes Heather, 2 votes Sierra, 1 vote Scott. So who does Zoe votes to Scott, and then these 2 vote Sierra, these 2 vote for Heather, Zoe votes to Scott. So who does Sierra vote for here? I think she votes for Gwen because of World Tour. So Sierra and Heather have to face a tiebreaker here. And I think whatever the tiebreaker is, I'm pretty sure Heather could beat Sierra in just about any tiebreaker. So I do think Sierra gets voted off in this episode. Now, episode 11 is Sunday, Monday, Sunday. Gwen and Duncan race together. Scott and Heather are trying to convince Zoe on their side to get rid of Gwen and Duncan. It's very close. I think it's a race. Heather doesn't do that great here, but Duncan wins the challenge since he was the best eater outside of them. And I think he'd be able to outpace Zoe in this regard, since Duncan's been really good in eating challenges. On top of the fact, I feel like Duncan just outpaces Zoe here, so I do think he wins immunity. And here, I think everyone actually Zoe votes for Scott. Gwen and Duncan vote for Heather. Heather votes all, and Scott, though, they have kind of a 2-person majority. They vote for Gwen because Gwen and Duncan are a couple. Heather gets eliminated. Now, in episode 12, Duncan just replaces Mal and ends up getting the Golden Chris. Zoe gets the Yeti and she still arrives, with Gwen getting the painting. However, it's guarded by Chef in this version. And although it may take Scott a bit of time, I do believe Scott could pull off the win and get the diamond off Fang. So Duncan is eliminated for being... So 4th place, Duncan. So Zoe is still the winner of the challenge, since I think Zoe could get there before Scott. So between Scott and Gwen, this is a pretty tough vote because she is friends with Gwen, but Gwen has made it to the finale and competed in more seasons. But I think in this version she'd actually go for Scott, since while Scott is evil and would go for Gwen for Scott, since Scott hasn't outright been evil throughout the season since he's only kind of worked with Heather. However, Scott also got rid of Mike, so I do think she'd actually go for Gwen here, since the 2 are friends. On top of the fact Scott's the only real villain left, and I think Scott would just be easier to beat than Gwen in the finale, since Zoe would want to crush Scott, proving that she's superior to him. So I think Gwen gets eliminated since they're a power couple, and Gwen and Duncan get flushed down the toilet together. So Scott and Zoe are both in the finale, with Cameron and Mike returning as Zoe's helpers, and Scott getting Lightning and Joe. So thank you guys for watching this information order on what if Lightning got the immunity idol. So I think this is pretty cool, and yeah, peace and farewell.